What do you see as the biggest challenges in conservation?
The growing human population. Because where we are, there's nothing else.
And do you have views about what should be done about that?
Can't you guess?
This is from the website of the Churchill Centre at the Churchill War Rooms in London, and it's written by Churchill's official biographer and posted on Churchill's own website. And it describes this is just part of it, Churchill's leadership of the eugenics movement in England, where he's calling for the sterilization of the unfit. He goes on at length about who is unfit, and we're faced with the problem that the birth of unfit people is unchecked by any of the old restraints of nature and fostered by civilized conditions. That's our real problem. So he called for compulsory sterilization, a simple surgical operation so the inferior could be permitted freely in the world without causing much inconvenience to others.
I'm going to speak about the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913. This act is important in all sorts of ways. Very importantly, it separated out the differences between something called mental deficiency and mental health problems, or what was then called lunacy. So it separated out, if you like, legislation for lunacy and mental deficiency, what has come to be known today as learning disabilities. So the 1913 Act really sets the framework in which what we call today learning disabilities have been understood over the past century or so. It established the three kind of key bits of what is mental deficiency. That is cognitive deficiency, social inability and communication problems. And it added a fourth, which was something called moral deficiency, which I won't speak about now, but people can guess at what that might mean. Important to remember that what we're talking about here at the end of the 19th century was an era of what you might call segregation. There was the era of concentration, the first concentration camps developed by British imperialism, you might say, in the Boer War. There was the era of the first Indian reservations, where in the US millions of Native Americans were corralled into reservations, and in the UK we got the first mental deficiency, for want of a better word, work camps, where people who had been kicked out of mainstream schools started to get segregated from society altogether and put to work in work camps. People with mental deficiency, the feeble-minded, were seen to interfere with the value and strength of the stock of labour by breeding, if you like, cross-breeding with people who weren't mentally deficient. The argument put by the Eugenics Society, Mary Dendy, Ellen Pinsent, the National Association, was that people with mental deficiency would reduce the stock of labour. The 1913 Mental Deficiency Act aimed at and set up the apparatus to separate these people out in order to defend the stock of UK labour. In the aftermath of the Act, from 1913 onwards, there was an approach towards mental deficiency that was based on the segregating of people with mental deficiency from British society. Initially, that meant segregation in long-stay institutions and work camps, and that approach has persisted ever since, to this present day. The segregation is different now. It's segregation within the community, if you like, but still segregation based on separate services, separate advice organisations, a separate analysis, separate schooling for people with learning disabilities within the community. But that approach, the segregationist approach, though tinkered with over the years for all sorts of reasons, remains that people with learning disabilities, people with what used to be called mental deficiencies, need to be separate from society. It's dressed up as for their own good, but people with learning disabilities can't deal with mainstream society. That's the argument put. So there's that angle, but there's also the angle that people with learning disabilities who mix freely in mainstream society are likely to reduce the quality of mainstream society. So that segregationist approach was set up 100 years ago next year by the 1913 Mental Deficiency Act.
He spoke about setting up, as Home Minister of England, he spoke about setting up forced labor camps for mental defectives. This part here is not on the Churchill website, but it's in all the newspapers. He was vice president of the first International Congress of Eugenics.
These were camps that were set up by a combination of British and American intelligence in order to train assassins. The first international network to run these assassin operations after the war and to do covert operations was something called the British American Canadian Corporation. It was founded by Wild Bill Donovan and Alan Dulles and some of these others. It was the first corporate entity. We had about 700 corporate fronts all around the world and involved the intelligence agencies of all three of the countries.
That was the one with room 3603 in the Waldorf
Yes.
Astoria in New York.
Exactly, and the man called Intrepid.
As far back as 1938, after Munich, there were two individuals who volunteered to assassinate Hitler. One was Mason McFarlane, who was our military attaché in Berlin. The other was my wartime chief in New York. He was then living in England and was a director of a company called Press Steel, Sir William Stevenson. Well, he was Mr. William Stevenson then. Well, both of these gentlemen volunteered to assassinate Hitler, and they were informed by Lord Halifax, who was then Foreign Secretary, that diplomacy had not yet been superseded by assassination.
And those were the elements that helped to bring Nazi intelligence here and to put essentially all the intelligence agencies in bed together to run the world agenda after World War II, and at least in the European countries and the ones that had won the war.
So wasn't BSC, you were in America working for BSC with Stevenson, didn't you assassinate people in America? Didn't BSC knock people off in America who were opposed to America joining the war? Weren't you?
No, I think one was on a ship. As far as I know, it was only one.
Only one.
I only know one on a ship who had been giving information to the enemy.
This should be said that in 1939, 1940...
Why was this chap assassinated?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
Only one man was assassinated?
To my knowledge, in the United States, by the British Security Coordination, which was under the direction of William Stevenson, there was one seaman on a neutral ship, I think it was a Portuguese ship, who was detected giving information to the Germans.
There is a point here, and I think you're right, and I think Mr. Haig's forgotten his own book, Room 303. If you read that alongside a man called Intrepid, you will see there was indeed a fairly serious campaign of disinformation and dirty tricks in North America aimed at the isolationist opponents of America joining the war. It was done by the British state, British government.
Let me ask this. Do we feel, is it a general feeling that in fact these kind of dirty tricks, in inverted commas, are perhaps perfectly legitimate if the cause is right? I mean,
in wartime.
Yes, but in wartime, but America wasn't at war.
My name's Terry Christensen. I am doing this action for my grandchildren and the grandchildren of the planet. I think it's very arrogant of these engineers to design this rig for the North Atlantic. I think it is a catastrophe waiting to happen.
You see the light here over there? We choose the Nazca lines because we think that these lines are a symbol for climate change. What happens here in the past, in a smaller scale, happens now in a global scale, and the Nazca culture disappeared because of climate change.
In the early 60s, Vancouver was a sleepy little provincial center going nowhere slowly. In many ways, it epitomized the British in British Columbia. It was courteous and colonial with very few problems and even fewer ambitions. There was still an air of the 50s around. Tourism was basically non-existent, and the city languished in its Pacific isolation.
As Al Fartheringham described it when he was a columnist at the Vancouver Sun, he said Vancouver was the most beautiful setting in the world in search of a city. It was part of a whole series of people right across the political spectrum who were tired of this, smug, provincial, tight-ass town, if I can use, I think, an accurate description of what the city was like until that period.
At the time, Mike Harcourt was a storefront lawyer working with kids in Gastown.
Trying to keep kids alive, basically. Kids that were on bad drugs, tainted acid, taking heroin and speed at the same time.
As the 60s matured, Canada celebrated its centennial with a World's Fair, Expo 67. But as thousands of young Canadians were taking excursions to Montreal to visit Expo, their American counterparts were embarking on much more sinister tours. The war in Vietnam sparked an unprecedented protest movement that exploded in the 1967 Summer of Love. At last, the 60s had arrived. It was a time of flower power, free love, and expensive ideals. The kids were hippies, the police were pigs, and the air was heavy with marijuana smoke and rehashed socialist rhetoric.
These were camps that were set up by a combination of British and American intelligence in order to train assassins. The first international network to run these assassin operations after the war and to do covert operations was something called the British American Canadian Corporation.
I've gone along with your the word hippie so far, and we would have to stop at this point and try to say what a hippie is, and this would take a great deal of time because my idea of a hippie and Vancouver Sun's idea of a hippie and somebody on 4th Avenue's idea of a hippie would probably be completely different things.
The 60s movement in North America was a West Coast phenomenon, and almost overnight, Vancouver became Canada's San Francisco, a mecca for legions of disaffected youth, pilgrims of protest.
Bob, why had you gone to Vancouver, and what were your first impressions of the city?
I had nowhere else left to go. I'd sort of run out of Europe. I was young, and I'd never been to North America, and one of my friends had gone there to Vancouver, and there was talk about jobs in the gold mines in the north, and that suited me. I'd just come out of working in an abattoir in Dublin, and I'd saved up. I knew I would only be there for 6 months, saving up enough money to get to Canada. And myself and my girlfriend went. We landed in Montreal, which to my dismay spoke French. I knew they did, but when I landed, and they actually do. And so I jumped on a bus and we went across Canada, and ended up in Vancouver. And I was trying to find out information about going north to the mines. And while I was there, I picked up the alternative paper because it was sort of the tail end of that period when there were alternative papers, and usually they had information if you were not living on the street, but also moving around and stuff. And there was an ad for someone needed in the bookshop there, and so I went down to Gastown and saw this man called Sharkey, who was this hugely big, small man with a long ponytail, and this sort of shop that smelled of hippie incense and things, but interesting books. And that was it. I asked for the job,
A new generation demanded a voice, and they found it in Vancouver in a little underground newspaper called the Georgia Straight.
In February and March of '67, suddenly this hippie phenomenon started, and people started coming to Vancouver, and there was the first Easter Bien was formulated then, and so we became a part of all of that and gave expression to it in the first issue of the paper.
And we did some things that were coups, you know, like Elton John was without question, I mean it's bizarre, but as big as the Beatles in this period. We did cute things. We had competitions for like teenagers, and like a 15-year-old was allowed to go along to Elton and interview him and take pictures. And I remember running photographs of Elton, his head cut off midway. And he was brilliant, and you know, he was going through a tough time then, and was a lot of things, you know, a lot of drugs and all that. But he was great with this kid.
The Cecil Hotel at the north end of the Granville Street Bridge is now a peeler bar. But in 1967, it was a hotbed of aspiring intellectuals, dissidents, and vagabonds. It was here that a young UBC math student and poet, Dan McLeod, with a small group of friends, conspired to commit journalism on their own terms.
The Georgia Straight could not have happened anywhere else. Nothing quite like the Georgia Straight would have occurred anywhere else. And I think the reason for that has a lot to do with the political culture of British Columbia.
Public exposure of the genocide by the Hitler regime during World War II gave the pet pseudoscience of the British royal household, the pseudoscience of eugenics, a bad name, because the practices of World War II demonstrated what the actual motives were of the eugenics movement, the culling of the human herd in order to perpetuate the power of this oligarchy. So at the close of World War II, the same exact people who were involved in perpetrating the fraud, the racial fraud of eugenics, set up a series of new organizations aimed at pursuing the identical policies, but simply under a slightly more benign public relations title: nature conservation.
The wind of change is blowing through this continent. And whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact, and we must all accept it as a fact.
In the early 1960s, as a cornerstone of Britain's phony decolonization policy, during the period of the winds of change, the World Wildlife Fund was founded specifically to be the instrumentality through which the House of Windsor in Great Britain would reassert in even more brutal form its imperial control over parts of the world like Africa.
Prince Philip is a gangster, is a bloody Nazi German bastard, come from nowhere, right? Born like a son of a bitch, right? 6 years old, he been thrown out from Greece, you know? He have no father, have no mother. If you want a child, 6 years old, being taken away from his parents who are completely crazy, right? By his auntie to bring him up, and those auntie married Hitler general, right? And the guy grew up with Hitler general. You want a fucking guy like that, fine? Ruling this country behind the scene. He's Hitler ruling Britain behind the scene. You think so? 100%, yeah, what?
It is a peculiar political culture that allows people to kind of reshape or think about remaking the world in their own image and likeness.
The city was now preparing to move up to the bigger leagues. In 1970, the Canucks played their first game at the Pacific Coliseum against Los Angeles. They lost, although few straight readers even noticed. The next year, a multi-million-dollar redevelopment of Gastown was sidelined when police clashed with 2,000 hippies at a smoke-in to protest drug busts. The Gastown riot made national news, and many blamed the Straight for inciting it.
It's what radicalized people like Art Phillips and Ed Sweeney, who were on the council then. When they were pushed into a doorway by the crowd, and a mounted policeman came by and said, you move out of that doorway and you're going to regret it, or words to that effect, right? And they said, hold it, we're members of council. Well, we don't give a shit who you are. You know, we get the same treatment. And the street was full, you know, right in the middle of all the mischief around that, publicizing it and talking about marijuana and whether it should be legal or illegal.
After the first tumultuous years, with legal fees outstripping production costs, the Straight seemed doomed to fold and fade into history. The 60s era didn't end with the decade, and Vancouver was still attracting a colorful assortment of renegades from all over the world. One of them would play a critical role in ensuring the Straight's survival, an eccentric young Irishman named Bob Geldof. In the early 70s, the paper was barely clinging to life. McLeod was in serious need of help. It arrived when an illegal immigrant walked in the door of 56A Powell Street.
Well, it wasn't Bob Geldof, it was actually Rob Geldof. And I never knew exactly why, but I think it had something to do with the immigration. But anyway, he came in looking for a job. Only job we had was working in the back room, stripping covers off of magazines, distribution. So he worked for a while doing that, and then somebody mentioned that he could write, so Geldof can write, you know.
And I said, well, I'm working here at the moment, but I've been a journalist, a music journalist in England, which was a complete lie. And I said, look, I'll take the pictures and I'll write up some things on local bands. If you don't like it, don't publish it, you know.
Later, he became leader of the Boomtown Rats and creator of Live Aid. But while in Vancouver, Geldof brought an almost messianic zeal to the paper. He wrote, photographed, and edited. He also organized benefits for the Legal Defense Fund and brought record companies on board as advertisers, while still finding time for some serious drinking at the Old Anchor Hotel.
Because the Straight had no fear of favors with anyone, you could essentially write what you like. And so I did. And no one bothered me, you know, and it was predicated on the fact that it would work, you know. If it didn't work, then you moved on to something else. And, you know, you were allowed to do this in this immense freedom.
Probably one of the most energetic people and dedicated workers who ever worked at the Straight.
You know, but the thing about Bob was, I guess, you know, he was what, you know, like he became famous for being the mouth, right? And one of the reasons the English music media loved him was he was so mouthy, and he's really outspoken, didn't care, and he made it quite clear that the only reason he couldn't care less for most of the music he was sent to review or cover, and he didn't like most of the people, and he thought a lot of them were just basically stupid. So his whole thing was that this is how I eat, this is where my clothes come from, this is where I get the free drinks.
And while I may be mouthy, I tend, as much as possible, to back it up. I tend to put my money where my mouth is, you know. I mean, if I say I'll do something, I'll do it.
With or without McLeod's permission, Geldof changed the Straight's focus from politics to music. He pioneered a new form of writing, rock journalism, of which Frank Zappa commented, "It's people who can't write, interviewing people who can't talk, for the sake of people who can't read."
There was no reason why a local underground paper didn't cover not just the local political scene, but the music scene. And so I started writing in a way I'd seen the English music press begin to start writing in. As the big acts came into town, we were in effect the only music mag in town. You could get reviews from the big papers, but we were the only ones who could carry it in depth. We thought that if we had a really good music section with really good writers and really good photographs and an excellent reviews section, a comprehensive record reviews section, I thought it would appeal to people who would normally be alienated by the paper.
Case in point of self-indulgency was in the brief time that I was editor, I put myself on the cover, which doesn't happen anymore, believe me.
Straight District Manager Nick Collier became good friends with Geldof.
Geldof used to make up a lot of things about the music industry. His random notes, he originated this column called Random Notes, and a lot of it was BS. He'd just make it up as he went along, but it was hilarious. He went to interview Kiss, and it was the first time, as I recall, that anybody had seen Kiss without any makeup on. And they actually let us take pictures during the interview, but the problem was we didn't have any money to pay for the film or the tape, so the camera had no film in it, and the tape recorder had no tape in it.
Dan and I had been on some adventures, and Nick and I, and we'd snuck into the United States because Dan was persona non grata, and I had no visas for Canada or the States, and we'd gone in this van and gone down to LA and stuff like that, San Francisco. And
I think Dan's greatest strength and greatest weakness is his management style, right? It's a weakness when he doesn't pick the right editor or executive editor or whatever, and steps away from the responsibility of doing it, and you've got to deal with this donut head, right? But that's also a strength when you have guys like, when you pick Geldof as editor, there was a guy who, literally loved doing what he was doing, and the paper was the main concern, right?
Undaunted, Geldof went gonzo long before the style became synonymous with the Rolling Stone.
I got a stylistics album to review, and I just put, this is shite, was the review, as far as I remember. That was it. I just couldn't be bothered anymore writing about why it was crap. It's crap. And the review was the stylistics, so and I just put, this is shite, next, wrote on there. And someone wrote in, some outraged stylistics fan, float on, or whatever that awful music was. And he said, well, if you think you could do better, why don't you just go and do it? And so I did.
Geldof left the Strait and Canada at the request of the Immigration Department. Today, he is Sir Bob Geldof to millions, and one of Britain's most treasured celebrities.
I left suddenly because I'd only entered on a 2-week visa, and no one had asked me in the paper for my social security stuff, though I was, going about the roundabout route of getting, dodgy papers, in order to enable me to stay. And I was seconds away from the police knocking on my door. I knew that because I'd been told.
One way or another, he had to go, and I don't think he really wanted to go, but I think he had to go. His immigration had run out, and so it was too bad.
But I'll certainly always remember it with deep affection, as the sort of launch platform of my life, not of my career, but of my life, for a crowd of people who managed to put up with me and let me get on with it.
In Vancouver, a green revolution was underway. A small circle of straight columnists and their friends had decided to form an environmental group. When Greenpeace was born, it was a home delivery, and the Strait was the midwife.
I think the Strait was absolutely integral to the development of Greenpeace. It gave voice to the growth of a movement that, while it was attracting media attention in the mainstream press, the Strait provided the depth and the continuity of coverage of Greenpeace issues, and reached out to the section of the public that was most receptive to that message.
The Georgia Strait took the issues that people who were drawn to Greenpeace took those issues seriously, took those questions seriously. It took a lot of the rest of society a couple of decades to kind of catch up to that.
At its inception, Greenpeace was strictly an anti-nuclear movement, but its leaders soon found themselves in troubled waters. Vicious infighting produced more Trotskys than Lenins, and the new manifesto became Save the Whales. It was no coincidence that the Strait played such a pivotal role in the evolution of Greenpeace. From its first issue, the paper had campaigned for myriad so-called green causes. Its list of firsts in ecological and conservationist concerns is unparalleled by any newspaper in the world.
Well, this is the environment. It's outside. I don't know what else the environment is. But it's about the whole idea of the way human societies might coexist with animal populations, whether they be whales or fish or birds. and the way cities might actually occur within the natural landscape instead of simply imposing itself upon and obliterating the natural landscape. These are ideas that were considered radical 30 years ago. I think they're ideas that guide and govern most public policy decisions today. The Georgia Strait knew that 30 years ago. The Georgia Strait knows that today.
The Strait can still be counted on to cover the issues that the mainstream press isn't covering. Not all the time, not every issue we'd like to see in print, but generally speaking, for the environmental movement as a whole, the Georgia Strait is a really good outlet for the information that we're trying to convey.
There was a time, there's no such thing as a cash flow of the Georgia Strait. There was, there's a flash flood. The money would come in and would be gone in 15 seconds. I mean, if I wanted to get paid, I would follow Dan down to the bank. In fact, I even had a relationship happening with one of the bank tellers. She would call me up. Tom, there's money.
But you always knew when the checks were going to bounce because he wouldn't be there. You'd get your check in an envelope and you'd go, oh, is Dan around? Oh, he's not here. Well...
For the next 5 years, the paper survived, not only because of McLeod's business acumen, but thanks to the totally selfless dedication of a handful of staffers with exceptional loyalty to the Strait's vision.
Get the name and... Yeah, get the name in here.
I think the paper wasn't selling that well. He was going through a lot of court battles at the time, so that every time a lawyer demanded a retainer, we'd look at each other, me and Grant, and go, uh-oh, okay, it's porridge next week. And it's almost that theory of last man standing, who's the greatest person in the world? Oh, the last man standing, And I think that's what Dan is. I mean, you could criticize the paper for different time periods, and you can go in and out of it, liking one year or hating the next year or whatever, but the fact he survived, and now he's starting to win some journalist awards, I hear, so he must be doing something right.
Well, you say that this story was suppressed, but...
This adversity forged some of the strongest talents to emerge from the Strait's pages.
Every time there was a big decision to be made, everybody would talk it out, and then everybody would look to Dan for the final answer, and he wouldn't be there. We were all thumbing our noses at various kinds of establishment, not the establishment, cap T-E, but every time we found anybody or anything that we thought was too puffed up and full of itself, or anybody who was too puffed up and full of themselves, we would go after them with harpoons.
Ripe for a takeover. One question remains: how long can one man avoid being bought out by a national media chain? When a dream becomes a reality, who wins, the dreamer or the realist? And which one of these is Dan McLeod? The future of the Georgia Strait is solely in his hands. Since 1967, he has embodied the spirit of the paper through its greatest victories and most humiliating retreats. He has certainly earned the enviable position he's in today.
In the 60s and early 70s, there were over 400 underground press syndicate papers, and the Georgia Strait is the only one left.
When it comes down to it, despite all the names you've mentioned, it's one man's thing. And though he's been ably supported and abetted by the supporting cast, it's been down to Dan. But it survived because of a core of people who still share the same ideals. And it's, I think, an object lesson in growing old disgracefully.
Yesterday, a big shot publisher was sitting in that chair asking me to sell. So it happens all the time. But I used to take it very seriously. I used to say, well, if they're going to offer me some crazy amount of money that's worth way more than it's worth, then why shouldn't I? But now I've decided, even if they do offer, more than it's worth. I don't feel like, I don't want to.
For tens of thousands of readers and scores of straight contributors, past and present, the sale of the newspaper to a major chain would be a disaster.
I mean, I think one of the things that has allowed the Georgia Straight to be what it has become is the fact that it is an independent newspaper. You know, if it did fall into the hands of a chain, and if it became simply a franchise, there's a very significant threat that what it had represented would clearly vanish.
Given that I was part of the crew and that we all had one objective, that this thing that we liked very much can indeed be a very successful medium and little ship that we were all bobbing about on the sort of waves of the zeitgeist on.
For the Straight to lose its independent voice and have its content dictated from a boardroom in Toronto or New York could represent a tragic loss, not only for the paper, but for the city of Vancouver itself.
I want to see the Georgia Straight continue to thrive and grow, and as an independent voice, not part of some chain where who knows what could befall it. So I'm good for a while yet.
Welcome to the LaRouche Connection. My name is Webster Topley. Today our topic is the case of the so-called Unabomber. As is widely known, the FBI has recently arrested a suspect, a certain Theodore Thomas Kaczynski. Mr. Kaczynski resided in a cabin without electricity or running water that was located near Lincoln, Montana. It appears that the FBI is preparing to accuse Kaczynski of at least some of the crimes attributed to the Unabomber, which is the label that the FBI has chosen to give to the person or persons responsible for a series of bombs and letter bombs, which over the past 18 years have killed 3 and injured 20 others. We must caution at the outset that while the FBI claims to have found some circumstantial evidence in Mr. Kaczynski's cabin, including a bomb or bomb components, these materials do not yet link Kaczynski with any of the bombing attacks that have made the so-called Unabomber infamous. Nevertheless, as soon as Kaczynski was arrested, the various scribblers of the media began to psychoanalyze him. Kaczynski was a hermit kind of guy, we were told, a pathologically reclusive man, an intensely private man, a bearded eccentric who had lived a Thoreau-like existence in a crude shack for the past quarter century. Kaczynski was a mathematician, a nerdy introvert, we were told, who had studied Kant before graduating from Harvard, where he obtained a PhD, then from the University of Michigan, and worked as an assistant professor at Berkeley, before finally dropping out, as it would appear, in 1969. And why did this recluse begin making bombs? Family pathology, say the adherents of this theory. Either his mother did not hug him enough, or he was jilted by his girlfriend back in Evergreen Park, Illinois, say these commentators. A prominent purveyor of these theories has been Clint Van Zandt, a former member of the FBI's deplorable behavioral science unit at Quantico, Virginia. As we have often stressed on this program, the myth of the isolated and disgruntled individual who is pushed by oppression or psychosis into a career as a terrorist is just that, a myth. Such cases are almost never found in reality. The quasi-psychotic individual may indeed be the raw material for the later terrorist, but the process will never be completed without the intervention of an outside force, usually an intelligence agency.
It's normally somebody who used to work for the CIA said to me last year, said, "Do you know who the head of Al-Qaeda is in the United States?" And I thought, blimey, what's he going to say? He said, "It's the FBI." And I thought, I must have had a look on my face. It was just the sort of look that you have when you encounter a conspiracy theorist. And he said, no, look at, the FBI method is to, the cartoon version of their method is to drive around town with a truck full of weapons looking for the maddest cross-eyed, bearded loon they can see, and say, "Oi, mate, do you want some guns? Do you want to perpetrate some evil on the United States?" And if this person happens to manage to be able to say yes, then they're got. And that's what he meant. Now, of course, intelligence services like briefing against each other, but it does seem, there are some pretty farcical cases.
An intelligence agency. The intelligence agency has the resources to provide the terrorist with money, favors, protection, publicity. The intelligence agency can also provide social support for the terrorist in the form of a movement of sympathizers who provide ideology, applause, encouragement, safe houses, logistics, and the like. One good method for discovering which political forces are backing the terrorist is to compare their propaganda. If the leaders of a political faction and a terrorist group use the same arguments or language or agree on a course of action, then there is reason to suspect that they may be connected. If we now examine the so-called Unabomber's ideological manifesto, published in the Washington Post in 1995, we find that the main thrust of the argument is an attack on industrial society and its scientific and technological underpinning. For the intelligence professional today, this is the familiar ID format of British intelligence in the City of London, the intelligence agencies most active against the United States today. The Unabomber's victims include science and engineering professors, airline officials, and more recently, business people connected to the timber industry and to the Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989. There are indications that amidst Kaczynski's reading material, there may have been found copies of Live Wild or Die, a publication close to Earth First, which has published an eco-bleeper hit list targeting the Timber Association of California, among others. In April 1995, the Unabomber killed by letter bomb a timber industry lobbyist, Gilbert Murray. In December of 1994, the Unabomber used a letter bomb to kill Thomas Mosser. The Unabomber later said that he had targeted Mosser because he was an executive of Burstyn Marsteller, a public relations firm which allegedly had helped Exxon clean up its public image after the Exxon Valdez incident. Burstyn Marsteller had, in its own turn, been targeted for exactly the same reason by Earth First in the February-March 1994 issue of its magazine. Earth First and its satellite, Live Wild or Die, are, of course, leading organizations of the radical ecology movement. We will hear much more about Earth First, which gained notoriety in the Pacific Northwest by placing steel spikes in trees so that they would maim or kill loggers trying to cut down these trees. Earth First was stridently pro-terror and pro-violence until 1990, when its founder, David Foreman, was arrested for trying to blow up a nuclear plant in Arizona. Since then, the facade of Earth First has become more respectable, while its satellite organizations incite to violence. It is clear that the Unabomber's targets and the targets of Earth First were the same. As for Kaczynski, whatever his eccentricity, he was not always a hermit. He is reported to have been a loudmouth and an ideologue who liked to attend pro-wilderness and other ultra-green radical gatherings. One of these took place in November 1994 in Missoula, Montana. It was sponsored by the Native Forest Network. Author Barry Clausen says that Kaczynski's name was on the sign-in sheet of this meeting. The Missoula meeting was attended by eco-terrorists and animal rights extremists from the World Wildlife Fund, the National Audubon Society, to Greenpeace, Earth First, and the Animal Liberation Front. Also on hand was a speaker of the Zapata Liberation Army, the terrorist insurgents from Chiapas province in southern Mexico. The Native Forest Network was founded in Australia in 1990 under the aegis of the Rainforest Action Network and the Australian Conservation Foundation. The latter group was founded and chaired by Prince Philip of Britain. Now, more evidence could be added, but the main point is clear. Kaczynski moved in the circles of the British-founded and British-backed eco-terrorism movement. The Unabomber's stated program is the equivalent of Prince Philip's, when Philip said that he wanted to be reincarnated as a deadly virus in order to kill people and thus fight overpopulation. Finally, If Kaczynski has indeed participated in the crimes of the Unabomber, important questions are posed. If these bombs required machine tools and electricity, and the shack had no current, who provided this key logistical backup? Where did Kaczynski get money to survive, as well as to travel around the country to place some of his bombs? Where did he stay overnight when he went on these travels? If he went to Afghanistan, as it appears he did, how did he pay for that? These questions suggest that the Unabomber is a network rather than a single person, and that this network will be found to be embedded in and directed by the same social milieu founded by Prince Philip and the Nazi Prince Bernhard of Holland back in 1961 when they created the World Wildlife Fund and its later ramifications. With us in the studio today are Jeff Steinberg, the counterintelligence editor of Executive Intelligence Review, and one of our regular guests. Also with us today is Roger Maduro, the author of a very influential refutation of the ozone hoax. I'd like to welcome both of you to the LaRouche Connection. And I guess the way to get at the issues posed by the so-called Unabomber story is to take it in the way that the normal news media never do, which is to study the network first and then bring it down to this individual case. So maybe we ought to start by this question. I've tried to pose it at the beginning. From Prince Philip to terrorist bombs in the United States, what's the connection?
Well, there's we documented extensively in the Executive Intelligence Review that there has been a whole progression of how these radical groups have been founded. From the time of the founding of the World Wildlife Fund, what you've had is a whole succession of groups being created, each one more extreme than the previous one. For example, you got World Wildlife Fund is founded in 61, and then in 68, 69, you have the creation of Greenpeace in Vancouver, Canada, as an anti-nuclear group. And Greenpeace was created as by British intelligence. The top people that created it were engaged, were all either directly members of British intelligence or been associated with it. And their first target was the United States and then France. And then after Greenpeace is created, you have another wave of groups. This whole wave of groups are created in the period 68 to 72 when the environmental movement was created almost out of thin air. And then you had a second wave of groups that were created in the period of 1978 to 1980 when you had the Sea Shepherd was created to conduct acts of terrorism in the high seas. Earth First was created with funding from the Sierra Club and the National Wilderness Society. The founder of Earth First is David Foreman, who's now a member of the board of the Sierra Club, and we'll see this a little bit later. And they were even more violent than the previous wave of groups that were created. So each successive wave becomes more violent. More recently, Earth First spun off a group called the Earth Liberation Front to carry out direct acts of terrorism because they wanted to separate themselves a little bit from what they call direct action. And the first clue as to how the network works is ideological. If you look at the founding principles of the World Wildlife Fund, they're identical to the founding principles of Earth First. And I want to point this out to you, and there's a set of quotes here I want to read to people to get an idea how closely philosophically Prince Philip of Mountbatten, the consort to the British Queen, is to David Foreman, the radical founder of Earth First.
He went around putting spikes in the trees and tried to blow up the nuclear plant.
And he's written, David Foreman has written a book, an entire book on how to conduct acts of eco-terrorism. They call it monkey wrenching. You know, how to blow up bulldozers and make bombs, and it's all in the book. It just describes to you how to carry out all these acts of irregular warfare. And they've done a tremendous amount of destruction that does not get reported in the news media. There's a private investigator Barry Clausen, who infiltrated Earth First for about 1.5 to 2 years in the early 1990s, actually got to meet the whole leadership of Earth First. He saw them committing acts of terrorism. He tried to report it to the authorities who didn't listen to him, but recently he has put together a whole grid of acts of eco-terrorism in the United States, and you have more than 200 acts of terrorism in just the last 4 years. And we're not talking here about tree spiking. We're talking about burning logging mills, for example, is blowing up logging mills. I mean, this is serious stuff. Now, on the question of Prince Philip, in 1988, Prince Philip was interviewed by a German press agency, and he stated, "In the event that I am reincarnated, I would like to return as a deadly virus in order to contribute something to solve overpopulation." A few months earlier, David Foreman, the founder of Earth First, wrote an article in the issue of Earth First Journal, November 8th issue, 87 issue of the Earth First Journal. "AIDS is not a malediction, but the welcome and natural remedy to reduce the population of the planet. Should human beings disappear, I surely wouldn't mind. Just as the Black Plague ended the feudal era, so AIDS will end the industrial era of progress. This is a good thing, since industrial progress brings population growth."
And if I'm not mistaken, in the most recent generation or degeneration of this whole phenomenon, you've got an animal rights activist movement who actually say that their program is to kill people in order to save animals and the environment, which I guess gets us right back to Prince Philip.
Yeah, this is the very openly stated purpose of the animal rights movement. It's very openly stated in all the circles. They couch it in different ways. Prince Philip is very nice about it. He said the world's population has to be reduced to less than 1 billion people. And most people don't even think in terms of what does that mean. How do you reduce the world's population to less than 1 billion people? Well, you can't just
4 billion plus.
You got to kill a lot of people.
Maybe I can ask Jeff now. We have to realize that many of our viewers have an epistemological difficulty at this point, which is how, again, can you get Prince Philip and these radical terrorists in the same boat? Maybe you could approach the connections from the
Yeah, I think there's a very important thing to bear in mind. Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, who you mentioned in your introduction, and he was literally a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party during the Second World War. In 1961, Prince Philip, Prince Bernhard, and a group of very wealthy, very prominent people, principally from Britain, the Netherlands, and a few other European countries, who were, among them, leading bankers, members of royal families, top corporate executives, launched the modern phase of the radical environmentalist movement. Radical in the sense that the ideas were a radical rejection of modern civilization, modern technology, the idea of scientific and technological progress, and population growth. As part of that effort, they tried to basically reintroduce pre-Christian pagan cultism and literally irrationalist practices into modern society. And the particular form that this took was the launching of the drug, rock, sex counterculture during the 1960s. Here in the United States, this was a decade of tremendous traumatic developments. The assassination of Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the riots, the war in Vietnam, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. People who came into the 1960s optimistic about the future, committed to careers in science or in industry or in education, had their minds scrambled. They became very confused, demoralized. They became susceptible to a top-down drug culture that was also being fostered by people like Aldous Huxley, Lord Bertrand Russell, again, prominent people from this international aristocratic, what you would call the oligarchy. Now, it's not surprising that it's in the late 1960s that groups like these radical environmentalist groups begin to proliferate. Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, these organizations begin to take on the character of mass social movements because for the first time in the modern period, in the post-war period, you've got a large bunch of people who've been driven stark raving mad through a combination of drugs, philosophical ideas that rejected science and technology and progress, the whole drug, rock, sex counterculture. So, in effect, what was created was a kind of labor pool of people who simply adopted ideas that were the prevailing views of this top-down, British-centered financial oligarchy. ideas expressed by Prince Philip in saying that world population growth is the greatest threat to mankind. We've got to kill millions or hundreds of millions of people. Now, in the late 1960s, Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard set up a very ambitious funding mechanism because now suddenly they had a very large international mass movement to bankroll. And they created an organization called the 1001 Club because 1001 very wealthy people were invited to become charter members. These were people on the personal phone directories of Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard. And the requirement for membership in the 1001 Club was, first of all, to be invited and to be in the social ambiance of these top people. And number two, you had to be willing to write out an initial check for at least $10,000 to create this seed fund of $10 million that went towards bankrolling the Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, and then, as Roger just indicated, Next Generation, an even more crazy, radical, wild group of people is spawned off of that to carry out even more violence. And what we've documented in the EIR, particularly in a series of special reports in the last 2 or 3 years, is that there is a remarkably small circle of people who include top executives. For example, the heir of the imperial chemical industry of Britain has gone from being a top official of the World Wildlife Fund to being a leading figure within Greenpeace. And so they commingle very easily and very comfortably with these sort of dregs or victims of the counterculture who've been basically picked up off the streets and are the kind of brainwashed victims of the ideologies that are produced at this high level. So it's actually a very rich contoured picture, and the degree of collaboration and the tightness of the control exerted amazingly by people like Prince Philip is very intense. This Native Forest Network, for example, which had the conference at the University of Montana in Missoula, which was attended by Kaczynski. This organization was founded a few years earlier in Australia by an organization that was at the time chaired by Prince Philip. So it's not some enormous magical leap from Windsor Castle down to this rather impoverished cabin in Montana where Kaczynski was hiding out.
Well, we've heard about the World Wildlife Fund, or whatever it calls itself today. We've got the Friends of the Earth and so forth. Why don't we focus a little bit on the more recent, more violent groups and get an idea of this social milieu? Now, we've mentioned some things about Earth First. As I understand it, they have a kind of a two-track theory where you want to have a public, legal organization that spews out propaganda, and then with some plausible deniability, you've got a kind of an underground wing that actually does the killing. And they seem to be telling everybody this is the way to go. So this gives us Earth First, and I guess this other thing, Live Wild or Die. What do we need to know about them?
Well, these are fundamentally, these really are pagan cults. What they believe in is in the same kind of philosophy that the Druids used to believe in, and
The
their
tree
newspaper.
cult.
Yeah,
Remember, the Druid horoscope is that the day you're born, you're assigned a tree.
Right.
And as I remember, the oak tree got 1 day a year, and that's what they all wanted because that was the best tree.
These are the tree huggers.
Yeah, the tree
Right,
huggers.
the tree huggers.
Well,
Prince Charles, of course, says he talks to plants. Prince Philip is somebody who has made raving speeches about Gaia, the mother of the gods. I guess that's close enough.
Well, they worship the earth. They worship Gaia. They worship. It's this pagan gods. And in terms of Earth First itself, if you look at their journal, the Earth First Journal is published on 8 pagan holidays, and that's when they hold their actions and their rendezvous and their big events are all centered around pagan holidays, and they worship paganism. So what you're looking at is not just a question of a bunch of people who want to protect the earth, which is not really what they're interested in. They're interested in worshiping the earth. And in scientific terms, they believe in what's called deep ecology. That's how it gets, or the biodiversity. Conservation biology is what it's called, in order to try to pass it off as a respectable theory, which it is not. It lacks any scientific evidence. But you have this whole underground, and in the Unabomber writings, he refers to it very explicitly in the letters that he sent to the New York Times, in a manifesto that he wrote. You pick up the manifesto and you pick up the Earth First Journal, and they're almost completely indistinguishable. Likewise, for these animal rights publications, like a declaration of war. The title is A Declaration of War, Killing Humans to Save the Animals. You pick that up and you put it side by side with the manifesto, and they're almost identical. And it is astonishing that the FBI missed this.
Okay, we're going to get to the FBI in just a minute. The Earth First, as I recall, in places like Washington State, Oregon, became an intense public issue. They put up signs in the community, if you're from Earth First, don't stop here, keep going. Right? They became hated by the people in these towns who they saw Earth First as a group that was out to destroy their livelihoods, right? To destroy
It's not just the Pacific Northwest. It's in California. It's in the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico. They're very active in Vermont and Maine. They're very active in Canada, stirring up all kinds of troubles. They have in Tennessee. They've been demonstrating against nuclear power plants. Likewise in Michigan. They're into what you call direct action. Is what they call direct action, which is doing things to stop production, doing things to shut down the nuclear power plants. As a matter of fact, at one point, a group of Earth Firsters, led by David Foreman, the founder, tried to blow up a nuclear power plant in Arizona. And he actually almost ended up in jail because of that. So they're very dedicated. And the debate that they've been having for the last 5 years is, well, do we carry out these acts of what they call monkey wrenching, which by actual official definition, both the Justice Departments and Interpol, these are acts of terrorism. Do we carry out monkey wrenching in our name, or do we set up an outfit, which they call the Earth Liberation Front, to carry out the acts of terrorism? And then what we will do is have the same kind of relationship that the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals has with the Animal Liberation Front has. You have PETA as the upfront group. They carry out radical actions.
PETA meaning?
People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals is PETA.
Right.
So PETA is the one that does the public relations. And then the Animal Liberation Front carries out the acts of terrorism. They blow up laboratories, they liberate animals, most of which die after they're liberated, so on and so forth. And, and they wanted Earth First to have the same kind of structure, and it has more or less worked like that. But the interesting thing is when you look at how all these things tie together, it's very interesting. You have somebody like Phil Knight, for example, who's one of the leaders of Earth First. He's also one of the leaders of the Native Forest Network, and actually one of the organizers of the conference that Kaczynski attended in Montana. He also happens to be the head of the Predator Project, which is an animal rights group defending predators from being killed.
Bring back the wolves.
Bring back the wolves. If they kill people, it's just too bad. They have a right to be here. Likewise for the mountain lions in California. I mean, they're protecting predators as an animal rights activity. He's also an Earth Firster. And then also, when Barry Clausen had infiltrated Earth First, he discovered that Phil Knight was also the actual head of the Western cell of the Animal Liberation Front, which is classified as a terrorist group by the FBI. So they're all completely intermeshed, and they're intermeshed very closely with Prince Philip. I'm going to just go back to the question of Prince Philip, how this actually works. Back in 1977-78, Prince Philip personally, through the World Wildlife Fund, requested that Greenpeace launch a massive international campaign to end commercial whaling. And the World Wildlife Fund provided Greenpeace with their first 2 ocean-going ships, precisely to carry out actions against whaling nations, Iceland, Russia, and Japan. And in '78, after a couple of years of semi-successful direct actions, they took an added step, which was that Prince Philip and Sir Peter Scott, who was then the executive director of the World Wildlife Fund, had a series of secret meetings at the headquarters of the World Wildlife Fund in London. And this has been aired in a documentary called The Rainbow Man by Icelandic filmmaker Magnus Gudmundsson. It was a really top-notch documentary. And what ended up happening is during the secret meetings, what they created with David McTaggart, the head of Greenpeace, Sir Peter Scott, and Prince Philip overseeing the whole operation, they created a slush fund of $5 million, and the money was given to a Colombian scientist called Francisco Palacios, who went around all these little nations, particularly in the Caribbean, Commonwealth nations, and he bribed these government officials to get them to get their countries to join the International Whaling Commission, and then let Greenpeace representatives vote for them at the meetings. And wherever Francisco Palacios went, he went with a letter of introduction from Prince Philip, ordering that official of the British Commonwealth to collaborate with Greenpeace in this whole operation. And by 1982, the International Whaling Commission had gone from having 17 members to having 37 members, and they had the majority, and they declared a moratorium on
Based
whaling.
on bribery.
Based on bribery, and they had no scientific evidence for it.
Now, you mentioned this animal rights movement, and again, for our viewers, some of them have seen these television things about Earth First, but the animal rights movement, I get the impression that this is more visible, better organized as something you might see, say, in London than in Chicago or Los Angeles or New York. Maybe you could just give us a sense of what it looks like. Suppose you go to a meeting of the animal rights movement. What do you find?
You'll probably find Brigitte Bardot.
Right.
Or a Jane Fonda.
Yeah,
a lot of the really bizarre characters in Hollywood, in the European film and arts community have bought on to this ideology. And I think it's very interesting to note that the founder of animal liberation, a guy named Peter Singer, wrote a book called Animal Liberation, which is sold by PETA and all of these organizations as the Bible of the movement. At the time he wrote it, he was a PhD student at Oxford University in philosophy, and he was doing his doctoral dissertation on the 18th century British philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who said that there is no difference between human beings and lower forms of animal life. We're all creatures out to find pleasure and avoid pain, and that's all there is to it. And the argument that was put forward by Peter Singer was that man is no better than lower forms of animal life. In fact, in certain respects, man is inferior, and therefore man has no right whatsoever to use animals for experimentation, for scientific discovery, for food, for clothing, or any of this. And just think for a minute, if a grown-up human being adopts this kind of ideology, then it really says anything goes, that there is nothing sacred about human life, and you can do anything you want to another human being in order to save some rodent or snail darter from going into extinction. And so you've got people who are literally wacko and who carry out very serious acts of violence. I think it's important that the Animal Liberation Front is thoroughly integrated. Very often, as Roger just indicated, you'll find the head of the Animal Liberation Front is also the head of the local chapter of Earth First or one of these other terrorist adjunct organizations. All of these things, we were talking about a certain phase earlier about the initial unleashing of the drug, rock, sex counterculture, which created a sort of labor pool of people to be drawn into a movement that was bankrolled with millions and millions of dollars from these European-based, and in some cases American-based, very wealthy, powerful old families that want to run the world and want to use these kinds of movements as battering rams against any kind of efforts to put forward modern industrial society, the nation-state system. So you had a second phase that began in the late 1970s. We picked up on it at the time. In fact, we were very much involved in the fight at this period of time in Europe, where suddenly Friends of the Earth, a guy named Brice Lalonde, who was one of the international founders and leading figures in Friends of the Earth, put out the line in France, and it spread all over Europe very rapidly, that nuclear energy was fascism.
Well,
and
plutonium was fascist.
Right, and that anything that could be done to prevent the spread of nuclear energy should be done. Now, it's interesting that among the leading figures, along with Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard, in the launching and continuing operations of the World Wildlife Fund was John Loudon, who was the chairman of the board of Royal Dutch Shell. The major multinational oil companies, particularly the Anglo-Dutch oil companies associated with Prince Philip's Club of the Isles apparatus of the leading royal families of Europe, were very much for their own reasons opposed to nuclear energy. And so this launching of nuclear terrorism, of environmentalist eco-terrorism, which began to be a big phenomenon in the late 1970s, in 1977, 1978, you began to have mass rioting at the sites of nuclear power plants. Probably one of the more famous incidents was in 1978 at Crémerville in France, where you had pitched battles between radical environmentalists and the French police over the effort to shut this place down. At the same time, you had an outbreak of terrorism targeting leading European industrialists, including Deutsche Bank's Jürgen Ponto, who was a leading advocate of industrial development, financial investment in large infrastructure projects in the Third World. You had Executive Intelligence Review's founder, Lyndon LaRouche, being told by German and American authorities that he was on the same hit list of eco-terrorist groups, including well-known, quote, left-wing terrorist groups like the Baader-Meinhof gang during this period, because he was a leading advocate at that time of fusion energy, as well as other forms of nuclear energy. There were many other issues involved, but the slogan that was used to set the troops wound up and in motion to carry out literally acts of murder was this nuclear energy equals fascism slogan. And I think it's important to bear in mind here in the United States more recently that if you think about the point that you made right at the beginning of the show, that the Unabomb network, not this single crazy lone supposed serial killer of mythology, but the real Unabomb network was part of this Earth First apparatus and carried out a series of bombings, including 2 murders and 20 other serious injuries over an 18-year period. You get an idea that this is a serious, substantial terrorist capability with only a small gap of space between the highest level, most prestigious kinds of figures, not just in the world environmental movement, but in the world superpower structure overall.
We're going to just one more point on this network behind this terrorism, and that has to do with the guy that you mentioned, Clausen, the guy who's written a book about his experiences in Earth First. Maybe you just sketch a little bit of that, and also he's been a figure now in Montana since this arrest, and has tried to come forward with some information, has been prevented from doing so by death threats. Maybe you want to fill us in on that.
He was going to give a press conference in Montana last Thursday, and on his way down, and when he got there, he got such a series of death threats, and the hotel was receiving bomb threats that that the police could not protect him, and they decided to cancel the press conference. And during that press conference, Clausen was going to hand out a whole packet of materials which documents from the writings of Earth First itself, from the statements of environmental leaders and other pieces of evidence that he has collected, that there is a connection between Theodore Kaczynski and Earth First and or the Unabomber, whether it's Kaczynski or not. So the connections are all there, and they're fairly straightforward and very clear. And the news media has picked up somewhat on this. He was on ABC TV on April 5th. They had him on as the lead item of news, and that caused an enormous uproar in around the United States, because for the first time you were getting something that is other than, oh, this guy's a loner. You know, where does he actually belong to? And the interesting thing about Clausen is he had Kaczynski pegged more than a year ago. He told the FBI as soon as Gil Murray of the California Forestry Association had been killed, he immediately, within 1 week, came out, within a few days, as a matter of fact, came out and he publicly said, look, this is connected, the Unabomber is connected to the list that is found in Live Wild or Die. And shortly thereafter he said, and the only place where that list was distributed recently was at the Native Forest Network Conference in Missoula, Montana. So he was there. And he had him pegged over a year ago. And it just took this long for suddenly this guy to be caught, but they could have done it a lot sooner.
Okay, now this brings us to our second complex of issues, which is the FBI. Did they get their man? I mean, have they solved, with quotes, the so-called Unabomber issue?
Let me start by saying that I think that there were undoubtedly individuals in the FBI who worked on the task force over this 18 or so year period who were inclined to go in the direction of a competent investigation. And there were people in the field office in San Francisco who were looking in the direction of this eco-terrorist apparatus. However, the overall character, the defining character of the FBI investigation into this case is an embarrassing, incompetent failure, which is in fact based on methods that themselves are clinically insane and could never solve a crime in a million years. Look at what happened. The FBI, particularly the Behavioral Sciences Unit down at their training facility in Quantico, Virginia, has basically developed a massive computer database of synthetic computer profiles. And the press coverage, by and large, since the arrest of Kaczynski, has been shaped by the garbage being spewed out of the FBI's computer in Quantico. What do they say? They say the Unabomber was a serial killer. They say that the Unabomber was some sort of lone person, as you said at the beginning, driven by psychological demons, internal demons, victim of a poor family upbringing, or something like this. Now, if you were to conduct a competent investigation, the first thing you would do would be to pull the plug on these crazy psychological profile, composite profile computers.
Make, what do they call them, perpetrator profiles or
right,
things like this?
Right, exactly. The first thing that you would have done was to simply do a scan of the pattern of people being targeted. And anybody who is willing to seriously look at the idea that the radical environmentalist movement is a serious, genuine terrorist apparatus engaged in a continuous pattern of criminal activity. Now, this involves breaking from the, quote, political correctness that you find every day of the week in the newspapers and on the TV news, in which environmentalism, including all of these crazy hoax, anti-scientific quack ideas, are given tremendous credence and popularity because it conforms to a certain political agenda. But if you looked at the targets, the very first thing that you would have concluded, which Barry Clausen concluded, which we concluded in looking at the pattern, was that the targets are all on the enemy's list of the radical environmental movement. You would have started by looking at the organizations, the publications, and you would have immediately defined a path of investigation that I'm certain would have led directly to not just Kaczynski, because we still don't know, for one thing, whether he's the guy or whether he's merely part of a broader network, but you would have taken a completely different approach to solving the crime. And I have no doubt that it would have been solved a lot sooner, and a number of people's lives, particularly the Burson Marsteller executive and the California Forest Association guy, their lives might have been saved. We don't know whether other people were killed by this terrorist apparatus, and it never made it into the FBI computer and doesn't even figure on this list. So the whole idea is that it was done, it was not a case that was solved by the FBI using these behavioral methods. In fact, I would submit that something very different happened. There has been an upsurge of irregular warfare targeting the United States since President Clinton was elected and inaugurated. President Clinton has broken from Prince Philip and his friends. The United States is moving in a different kind of policy direction, and unlike the Bush presidency, when we didn't have any terrorist problems here in the United States, look what happened as soon as Clinton came into office. Shootings at the CIA, the World Trade Center bombing, over 20 assassination attempts against the president, the Oklahoma City bombing, all of these kinds of things going on. We are targeted as a nation for a campaign of low-intensity warfare, and I would say that what happened is that it was time to escalate the eco-terrorist component of this multifaceted irregular warfare offensive. Because what happened? You had the Oklahoma City bombing, and for the first time after that, the Unabomber sends a letter to the New York Times claiming credit for a terrorist action and putting his ideology out on the table. It was known to anybody seriously investigating the pattern of targets that it was the eco-terrorists, that it was Prince Philip's minions, but now suddenly it's being advertised. And then the next step was the publication of the 35,000-word manifesto by the New York Times and the Washington Post. The case was solved because Kaczynski's brother came forward and recognized the clear signature of his writing and his philosophy in that Unabomber manifesto. And it still remains to be seen whether Kaczynski was the actual author or whether he was merely part of a broader network, or maybe just somebody peripheral. Maybe he's the Lee Harvey Oswald of the eco-terrorist operations. But if you step back a second and look at the whole history of how the FBI, even at its best, has tended to operate within very narrowly circumscribed ground rules. You never go after the citizens above suspicion. You never go after the Prince Philips or the McGeorge Bundys of the Ford Foundation, which bankrolled in millions of dollars this radical environmentalist movement, including the entire New Left terrorists. So if you're not willing to go after that command structure, and as we've said earlier in the broadcast, the difference between Prince Philip and David Foreman is not very great. They rub elbows. They show up at meetings together. Under those circumstances, there's a built-in prejudice against solving the case among some of the political figures that define the activities of the FBI. And the best way to ensure that you'll never solve a case in a million years is to resort to these quack methods of going to a computer and asking the computer to solve the crime.
We have to have two quick answers to questions that remain. First of all, what is really known about the so-called Unabomber? What is that in about 5 minutes or less?
Well, he's carried out a whole string of bombings.
She, they.
Well, this is the interesting thing. The Unabomber in all his writings always talks about we, and he has been very consistent that he's part of a movement, and he even tells you the literature that belongs to this movement. I mean, he's very clear that he's never referred to him as I have. There's never the I, it's always the we. And it is the FBI and it is the news media that says, oh, this guy is a loner. He's never said he's a loner. In terms of what they found in his cabin, I mean, there's all kinds of evidence. Perhaps
Well, hang on. We're going to get to Kaczynski in a minute, but now we're still in the Unabomber, right? Because I think these are still separate until proven convergent. And the kind of people that he's killed, right? We've mentioned a timber executive, right? That seems to be right up the alley of Earth First, right? Then you've got this other guy who worked for Exxon and so forth. And very early on, one of the most tragic cases was an Air Force officer who wanted to be an astronaut who somehow
but realized it was in a biology laboratory in Berkeley. He's targeted some of the same targets that animal rights activists have targeted. Some of the same laboratories, as a matter of fact. So there has been a very consistent pattern of this. He's done against high technology, computer people, airline industry, against industrial targets, you could say that, Exxon, and against targets that animal rights activists and environmentalists would pick. I mean, this has been his pattern. There has been a very large amount of bombings that have not been ascribed to the Unabomber. I think that those bombings should start to be examined. There's been an enormous amount of bombings that have been unresolved and have been mostly unreported. Particularly
proportionally, how many would you say? I mean, compare the Unabomber ones to the unsolved and even unattributed ones.
Well, it's difficult to say.
In terms of numbers of incidents.
Oh, well, in the last 6 months, you've had a whole string of bombings of Forest Service Office, for example, with pipe bombs. And the pipe bombs are very characteristic of the kind of pipe bombs that Earth First members would have used for their targets.
I think there's another thing to bear in mind also. You, I think very correctly said, let's talk about the Unabomber and not about this person in jail in Montana, Kaczynski. Bear in mind that the FBI computer invented the Unabomber. There was never a manifesto from the Unabomber. The FBI created the term referring to a kind of a composite of the mathematics, the university targets, which were some of the early targets, and some of the airline industry targets that were also early targets. So the whole idea, which has been completely adopted lock, stock, and barrel by the general media, that there even is a Unabomber, as opposed to a terrorist network embedded within the environmentalist apparatus that's been doing a lot of nasty things for quite a number of years. This is a construct, and as I say, it's another reflection of this incompetence of this behavioral computer coming out of the FBI headquarters. They made up a name. They made up a person that may never have existed, that there may not be a Unabomber. The standing presumption that
he's a hologram in their
that's
computer.
correct. Exactly. Exactly.
I mean, and look at
it's a piece of cybernetics that's been picked up by the media.
I mean, and look at the stuff that they're finding in his cabin. I mean, they're finding the amount of supplies that he has, the amount of equipment that he has. This is a veritable bomb factory. But you can't manufacture bombs there because you don't have electricity or machine tools. I mean,
Now we're talking about Kaczynski. We're shading
well,
over
let's switch to Kaczynski. Now, the Unabomber, okay. Now, what do we know about Kaczynski,
But you
really?
see, this is what I was getting to. I mean, this guy, he's got a cabin, and he's got all these different types of bombs that the Unabomber has not used.
Well, let's also take it...
he also has, you know...
Let's take it from a different standpoint. Let's go back to the beginning. We were discussing the fact that in the late 1960s, there was a concerted top-down effort involving the Prince Phillips, the McGeorge Bundys, the Bertrand Russells, the drug counterculture, to get some of the best and brightest of the American college-age and slightly older generation to turn on, tune in, and drop out. Ted Kaczynski was not a loner. He was part of a mass exodus. He was a victim of a phenomenon that was organized to destroy an entire generation of future potential American scientists, academics, political leaders, you name it. Now, the whole idea that this FBI computer generated of a loner and an isolated individual, it may be held up during the first 24 hours when they showed pictures of this cabin, but it is not even held up to the scrutiny of some, just straightforward reporters who've knocked on some doors and asked people who knew this guy what he was like. If you looked at the Harvard annual yearbooks of alumni, he's all over the world. He's not just simply hiding out in a cabin in Montana for 25 years. At one point, he's traveling around Latin America. Nobody has yet even said publicly where in Latin America he was living, but he apparently spent a good deal of time. He's self-taught in Spanish. He writes and speaks it fluently. He lived somewhere in Latin America. I don't know, maybe he was a member of Sendero Luminoso, cultivating
or
cocaine.
Some Colombian group
right.
On the same track.
Right. In the late 1980s, the Harvard yearbook has him listed as living in Afghanistan and living in a specific city in the frontier of Afghanistan that was known as a counterculture mecca. It was also, by the way, a major area where the George Bush, Ollie North, Afghazi terrorist operations were training, were manufacturing and selling drugs, were running a war against the Soviet army inside Afghanistan. So, quite frankly, we know very little about this guy, but yet already what's being even admitted to in bits and pieces here and there does not at all conform to this idea of some loner. He was apparently at this Native Forest Network conference at the University of Montana, which was a pep rally for the Zapatista Liberation Front. It was a strategic move to integrate Latin American terrorist networks with the radical environmentalists in the United States.
We might say indigenous or indigenous groups of threatened peoples from Latin America and elsewhere.
Right, exactly.
To move them in with these regionalists and ecologists of the U.S. side. So in actuality, Kaczynski may turn out to be a gregarious, dynamic, globe-trotting...
Right, he could be Don Juan for all we know. He could be swashbuckling...
The stories that he doesn't like drugs also may not stand up to that Afghan stint. Well, all right, look, we have just a few minutes left, and in this context, maybe we can try to do what is also never done, which is to try to situate this within the context of world terrorist developments in general. People have been noticing lately that the the financial infrastructure of the Hamas movement in the Middle East is all based in Britain. That's where the money all comes from. That when a bomb goes off in London signed IRA, that may be the MI5 British intelligence branch of the IRA. This EZLN in the Zapatistas there in Chiapas, also backed by the British, and of course you've got the British support gloating over the Waco bombing, gloating over the World Trade Center bombing. How can we locate the Unabomber, again with the quotes hanging off, within this worldwide pattern?
Again, you've got a lot of brand names out there. The invariant is irregular warfare directed from London. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Prince Philip gets on the phone with Ted Kaczynski and says, go kill this person. The way this thing works is much more the Punch and Judy principle. You've got a lot of players, puppets on a stage. They're puppets in the sense that they don't control the way they think. They've bought onto ideologies. These ideologies are Madison Avenue packaged. They're very expensive. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on mass media to basically create these ideologies. You've got the militia survivalist ideology, which ostensibly battles against the radical environmentalist ideology, but in point of fact, they collaborate on many things. You've got a whole nominally Islamic terrorist apparatus stalking the planet, all of which, when you scratch the surface, goes back to this war in Afghanistan, which Kaczynski may have even been involved in some way. So you've got many different brand names and labels.
You've got Latin American indigenous peoples. You've
Right.
got Buddhist terrorism. You've got Orthodox terrorism. You've got Protestant. You've got Roman Catholic. You've got Zoroastrian and all kinds.
But ultimately, what we have consistently found, and not just us, the Egyptian government, the French government, the Algerian government, the Israeli government, the PLO, have all filed official démarches, diplomatic démarches with the British government over the fact that all roads lead to London when you're talking about global terrorism. And I would actually add that there are some very interesting developments in the Oklahoma City case. The attorney defending Timothy McVeigh has apparently stumbled onto some very interesting leads that suggest that there are some very strong British ties to the Oklahoma City bombing. We've said all along that McVeigh and Nichols could not have conceivably done that on their own, that at best they were low-level pawns in a much bigger effort. And independent of what we've said, McVeigh's attorney is now saying there are important leads that suggest that even some of the explosives may have been provided from certain of these political networks in London, which also play in the realm of the Punch and Judy show.
Well, I guess that's at least a look into this vast panorama of terrorism and sweeping away at least some of the myths that have been thrown around this so-called Unabomber case and the person of Kaczynski. I'm afraid that's all we have time for this week. I'd like to thank Jeff Steinberg of EIR, Roger Maduro, and this has been the LaRouche Connection. My name is Webster Tarpley, and we look forward to seeing you next time around.
Exposure of the genocide by the Hitler regime during World War II gave the pet pseudoscience of the British royal household, the pseudoscience of eugenics, a bad name, because the practices of World War II demonstrated what the actual motives were of the eugenics movement, the culling of the human herd in order to perpetuate the power of this oligarchy. So at the close of World War II, the same exact people who were involved in perpetrating the fraud, the racial fraud of eugenics, set up a series of new organizations aimed at pursuing the identical policies, but simply under a slightly more benign public relations title, nature conservation.
wind of change is blowing through this continent. And whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact, and we must all accept it as a fact.
In the early 1960s, as a cornerstone of Britain's phony decolonization policy, during the period of the winds of change, the World Wildlife Fund was founded specifically to be the instrumentality through which the House of Windsor in Great Britain would reassert in even more brutal form its imperial control over parts of the world like Africa.
Prince Philip is a gangster, is a bloody Nazi German bastard, come from nowhere, right? Born like a son of a bitch, right? 6 years old, he been thrown out from Greece, you know? He have no father, have no mother. If you want a child, 6 years old, being taken away from his parents who are completely crazy, right? By his auntie to bring him up, and those auntie married Hitler general, right? And the guy grew up with Hitler general. You want a fucking guy like that, fine? Ruling this country behind the scene. He's Hitler ruling Britain behind the scene.
You think so?
100%, yeah, well.
Okay,
he's the power.
Okay,
yeah.
we'll talk about that
And
later.
he's the guy. How can he accept my son?
Okay. If Prince Philip walked in here now and sat down here, what would you say to him?
I will tell him he is the biggest gangster, crooked person in the history of a great nation. He been imposed, brought in like a son of a bitch, grow up with no parents, grow up with the Nazi, and he's a Nazi at the core. He's sick, he's diseased, he's mentally gone, you know, with nothing, no honesty, nothing, and I can just believe that he's still there, and the royal family is still there.
I just got this morning from one of our European offices a urgent appeal. This is a tiger in the crosshairs of a telescopic sight. It's an urgent appeal from the World Wildlife Fund saying this is probably the most urgent appeal that they've ever launched. And they point out the fact that a number of species face extinction. Now that latter point is true. And it's true because they directly, and in some cases Prince Philip personally, killed these animal species. The WWF at its founding in 1961 took under its wing, in particular, the African elephant, the African rhino.
In 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met on a battleship, and they issued jointly what was called the Atlantic Charter. It had been drafted by Sumner Welles, and this is Sumner Welles' typed copy of the original with of a draft with Franklin Roosevelt's corrections. Welles was FDR's policy chief at the State Department, not Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State. Certain common principles on which they based their hopes for a better future for the world. This was what we were fighting for, and this became the standard for all representatives of Franklin Roosevelt, and it was rejected by all of his opponents, domestic and abroad. That is, the real opponents. But this was the rallying point, the Atlantic Charter. They respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them, and to bring about improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. British Empire leader Winston Churchill doesn't apply to our empire. He said this is in a speech in London in 1942. Let me make this clear in case there should be any mistake about it. I have not become the King's First Minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, that society of nations and communities gathered in and around the ancient British monarchy.